Welcome to the Laverne Church of the Brethren's weekly audio message. Here at the Laverne Church of the Brethren, we create a Christian community called by Christ to be inclusive, caring, and peace-minded. We affirm that people of any race, ethnic identity, gender identity, sexual orientation, ability, age, economic status, faith tradition, or life situation are welcome in our congregation. We believe in compassionate service, stewardship of creation, respect for diversity, and nonviolent reconciliation for differences among all people, nations, and faith traditions. We claim no creed but the New Testament as exemplified by the life of Christ. We strive to follow the way of Jesus. And through these efforts, we seek to grow ever closer to the mind and heart of God. And now let us ground ourselves as we enter into today's message. Our second scripture today comes from the book of Matthew, chapter 23, verse 37. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing.
Welcome to Between Two Ficus, a new Laverne Church of the Brethren talk show. I'm your host, Ron Faus, interim co-pastor. Welcome to this studio audience, and also to those joining us on Zoom, YouTube, and Spotify later. Today, Amanda and I begin a series on imagining God. We will be exploring how our images of God can help or undermine our relationship with God and with other people. We are also interested in how we imagine God influences our ability to be a place where many cultures and ethnic groups can connect with God and choose to follow Jesus here. I heard a story about President Abraham Lincoln. It wasn't firsthand. Oh, we back? Okay. It wasn't firsthand with Abraham Lincoln, but I heard this story about President Abraham Lincoln. He was in an art gallery, and someone pointed out a painting to him and said, "President Lincoln, what do you think of this painting?" And President Lincoln said, "I think the artist honored the second of the 10 Commandments." The person who asked the question said, "Well, what do you mean?" "This painting looks like nothing in heaven above, earth beneath, or waters below." So that brings us to the second commandment. You shall not make for yourself an image in the form of anything in heaven above, or on earth beneath, or in the waters below. And you should not bow down and worship any such image. I think any talk about images of God and imagining God has to begin here. That for the Hebrew folks, in the Hebrew Bible, they started out not having any images of God. That was something they were not to do. It was the second commandment. Although graven images were not allowed, the Hebrew Bible records vivid images that represented God's presence in word form, but they were visual images. The burning bush before Moses. Remember that one, that the fire does not consume, and from that burning bush God speaks, and the voice of God calls Moses into service. The pillar of clouds by day and the pillar of fire by night, guiding the people of Israel through the wilderness. Mountains as a place where one could go experience God. It was to a mountaintop that Moses went to receive from God the 10 Commandments. The people of Israel had a tabernacle, which was a movable place or location of God. It was a movable place of God's dwelling that the wandering people of God would take with them. And they would set up this tent, or whatever it was, we're not quite sure. They would set this up in the middle of their camp to show that God's presence was with them. And not only with them, but that presence was the center of their lives. Jump a few centuries ahead to a time of the early church. Some of the earliest Christian art were etchings on tomb markers. Artists in the Greek world, to which Christianity had spread, used stencils that they already had, but gave them Christian meanings. For example, the beardless shepherd boy, which was a representation of the Greek god Apollo, on Christian funerary art became to represent Jesus as the Good Shepherd. At least 2 generations later, images of God emerged, depicting God as an older white man with a long white beard. This image of God bore an uncanny resemblance to the Greek god Zeus. They used the images that they had and appropriated them to the Christian story. Dina Pence taught a class on Christian art last month called Seeing Scripture, looking at New Testament stories as depicted by artists down through the years by different cultures. But most of the art that was used was from European cultures. There was a question that came up in class, well, why were the earliest European art pieces inhabited only by white people? And I thought one of the best answers that came up in class was that artists wanted to sell their work within the society that they were, and the depictions had to be relatable to their target audience. Plus, it enabled people in that culture and time to feel like they were a part of the Bible story in a way that maybe they wouldn't if it was, say, if Rembrandt, instead of dressing people in Middle Age garb, European garb, if Rembrandt would have tried to draw paintings with Middle Eastern scenes and folks in it, would that have really been relatable to the people of his day? And artists from different cultures do the same thing to this day. African artists paint Bible scenes as occurring within African culture. Latin American artists do paintings and art pieces according to their culture. Dina and the class decided that it's not wrong necessarily for artists to try to make Bible scenes relatable to their culture. But what is wrong is when one culture insists that their art and their representation is the right one and the only acceptable one to worship. And unfortunately, that has happened down through the years, but also recently. As Europeans colonized increasingly farther flung lands, they brought a European-looking Jesus with them. Jesuit missionaries established painting schools and taught their new Latin converts Christian art, but only to do Christian art in European mode. In colonial Latin America, called the New Spain by European colonists, images of a white Jesus reinforced a caste system where white Christian Europeans occupied the top tier, while those with darker skin from perceived intermixing with native populations marked considerably lower. In the centuries after European colonization of the Americas, the image of a white Christ associated him with the logic of empire and could be used to justify the oppression of Native and African Americans. But the all-time most reproduced image of Jesus comes from the 1940s. It is Warner Sallman's light-eyed, light-haired head of Christ. Salman, a former commercial artist who created art for advertising campaigns, successfully marketed this picture worldwide. Through Salman's partnerships with two Christian publishing companies, one Protestant and one Catholic, the head of Christ came to be included on everything from prayer cards to stained glass, faux oil paintings, calendars, hymnals, and night lights. Salman's painting culminates a long tradition of white Europeans creating and disseminating pictures of Christ made in their own image. In a multiracial but unequal America, there was a disproportionate representation of a white Jesus in the media. It wasn't only Warner Salman's head of Christ that was depicted widely. A large proportion of actors who have played Jesus on television and film have been white with blue eyes. Just a few years ago, a host on a morning television talk show in the month of December exclaimed with an air of authority, "Everyone knows that Jesus and Santa Claus were both white." On Earth Peace is an organization related to the Church of the Brethren. They work at conflict resolution and conflict transformation, and also educate us on things like racism that we should pay attention to. And now I would like to invite my special guest to today's talk show, Linda Himes, who is our On Earth Peace ambassador. Linda, if you would come and if you would greet her as she comes down, that'd be great.
Thank you.
Is your mic on?
No, wait. It's on, yes?
There
okay.
we go. Here we go. So, what year did On Earth Peace begin the Combating Racism program?
Well, I can say they've been working on that for a long, long time. But here at this church, in the recent history, on February 22nd, 2020, we had somewhere between 30 and 50 members of this congregation attend a day-long training on kinging in nonviolence. And so in that training, we learned about Martin Luther King's principles of nonviolence. We delved into how he was strategic in addressing conflict and injustices, and we learned how the principles were applied to various campaigns. Now, an important part of any training, I used to be a trainer, is that you have to apply what you're learning. Because if you don't, in my opinion, you've kind of wasted your time. So that's where the Combating Racism program began here in the church. Racial justice was not achieved in the racial movement of the 50s and 60s. And yet I would say, in all honesty, at the time of that training, I was pretty ignorant about the depth and breadth of the ways that racism still exists today. So those of us who were at the training chose whether we wanted to work to combat racism in the denomination, within this community, or in our congregation. And so I was lucky enough to work with a wonderful group of people to address ways that we could learn as a congregation more about the ways that racism exists today and how we may be implicitly biased or unknowingly practicing racism.
You mentioned that one of your findings, one of the things that you did, I believe, was you got together some folks who were in the midst of the congregation, but not Caucasian. So part of our multi-ethnic folks already, you got some of them together and interviewed them. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. You know, as we met as a committee, we realized how difficult it is to see ourselves, our practices, and our ways of being that might be racist. You know, no one here likes to see themselves as racist. And actually, we kind of pride ourselves on not being racist. And yet I realize that I can't deal with the issue of racism if I don't believe it exists today, and not just among the extremists. I I had to realize there might be things that I say and do that entrench me in this white dominant culture, and that I may be doing or saying racist things, because I don't know what I don't know. And I don't know how I may come across to others. So our group decided that we really needed to know what it looked like from the other side. And so we wanted to know what brought people of color to our church, and we wanted to learn the things that we're not thinking about that make it difficult to be a part of this church and to feel a sense of belonging. So during the interviews, we interviewed 14 people, and we learned that most of the people we interviewed mentioned preaching, music, and social justice focus as the reasons that they came back. And this was a place, they told us, where you weren't told what to believe, but you were invited to live the questions. Now, some suggestions came out during those interviews as well, and as a committee, we charted those, and we began sharing those suggestions with appropriate groups and people. And one of the things that came out was the desire to integrate other cultures into our church, and that there's no visual representation of other cultures or heritage. And we had a lot of serendipitous moments, right? But one of those was at the same time that we were conducting and analyzing the interviews, the Envisioning Commission had invited Drew Hart, who is an author of the book, one of the books he wrote is Who Will Be a Witness? And he spoke in a Zoom convocation, because this was during the pandemic, with our congregation. So I led a book study prior to his visit. One of the challenges he gave us as readers was to take a tour of your church grounds and look at what kinds of pictures, symbols, and images are present and analyze those. So we did that, and we looked around and we saw we had rainbow flags. We saw there was at that time a Say Their Names display. We have a peace pole outside with various languages on it. We have the cranes. We have, I don't know if you've seen it, but there's images way above the organ pipes, and on the quilt that's out there in the narthex. And there are various symbols in the architecture of the church. And we realize that we are known in the community as a church that's open and affirming, but can passerbyers or visitors notice that we are an anti-racist church? So we began to discuss this idea of mirrors and windows. So as a teacher, I was asked to analyze all the books in my classroom library and ask, did these books provide mirrors where students could see themselves? And did they provide windows into experiences of other ways of living? And you see, without those mirrors and windows, it's very difficult to feel welcome and feel that you can ever belong in a place. So the idea of bringing in images from various cultures was born out of that examination. And we asked, what would it say about who we are if people who entered our church saw works of art that represented different people and different cultures?
Okay, I like the idea, but I also know we have budget difficulties. And it sounds, collecting art pieces sounds really expensive. So what did your committee do about that?
Well, it's actually an amazing story, because we had just begun this discussion about purchasing art. And we ran across the same thing. Oh my gosh, to purchase nice art is expensive. Even we thought about, well, would licenses to show things digitally work better? And it was summer, so we took a couple months off. But a month after our discussion, I got an email from Pastor Susan saying that the Bedfords, who I didn't know, wanted to offer art from their travels around the world to our church. I mean, it was truly serendipitous. So we got to go over and meet Jerry Bedford and his wife. And they worked for Heifer International, and they traveled around the world with his wife, Anna. And through that, they had quite a collection of art that they gathered in their travels. And they offered us 30 pieces of art that we could display here at the church.
That's wonderful. Those of you who are new may not have ever heard of Heifer International. It started out as something called Heifer Project. And it was begun in the Church of the Brethren by a rancher who was trying to figure out how do we help people after World War II in Europe recover from the decimation of war, and how can we do it that maintains their dignity? And so he had this idea, well, if we give a cow to a person and then ask that person to give the offspring of that cow to another person, it would be a gift that keeps on giving. And that was the beginning of Heifer Project, and now it's more than cows. Some of you who've been here for a while may have raised Heifer Project animals. Anyone in here raise animals for Heifer Project with your family? I see that hand. I see that hand. Yeah, I know there were some folks on 2nd Street that raised goats for Heifer Project, for example, and gave them away. So that's a little background. So Jerry and Anna were involved with Heifer International, traveled all over the world, and while they did that, they collected art, and they did it in a way for people to feel like they were connected to the people of other lands that they were giving to, and also for the people of other lands to feel like they were a part of everything. So I got a little more information about the Bedfords that I also received from Susan Boyer. Maybe some of you have heard of her. She's a former pastor, just so you know. And I was just amazed, and she confirmed that this call came out of the blue from the Bedfords. I thought, someone had to leak the information. And no, she said they just contacted us, and yeah. So it's a wonderful story. I first saw the pieces of art in the leadership retreat in January. We took a tour of the facility, and we got to this room, and there was all this amazing international art, and I didn't know what it was for or why it was in some room hidden somewhere. And I said, hey, could I have some of these to hang up in my office? And I was quickly reprimanded. And no, that's something that's going to be used for a special project. And art pieces from that multicultural art project are being installed this month. So you will see many pieces of art displayed coming soon. What do you, and the committee of folks that you work with, what do you hope will be achieved by posting the multicultural art?
Well, my hope is that these images will enhance our worship experience. You see, art too is a mirror and a window. And as the displays of art change every year and throughout each year, I hope that people will stop and look. And that's one of the reasons we want to change it up, so people will look. And then I want them to look again, because when you look at an art piece the second and third time, or sit and look at it for a period of time, you begin to see things you didn't see before. Art can help us understand history, culture, and the experience of others in a way that can't be achieved by any other means. My hope is that as visitors walk through our doors, they are surprised and say, wow, this church sees God as more than a white God. I can see myself in this art. I do want to say that I know that hanging art from different cultures is not going to make us an anti-racist church. That's the job of each of us here, as we're called to live as Jesus, to love our neighbor, and to work to end racial injustices in our communities and our country. Hanging art for me is a reminder that maybe my God has been too small. Hanging art is a way to connect ourselves and to others. It's a chance to see more deeply. My hope is that it shares who we want to be in this community.
Well, thanks so much for your work, Linda, and the work of the committee that you were part of, and the folks you interviewed. And there were some donated art pieces from some other folks beyond the Bedfords, too, so we'll want to remember them. I'd like to conclude this first episode of Between Two Ficus with reminding you of a picture that I posted on my Facebook page and the church Facebook page. It was a picture of President Obama with a 5-year-old African-American boy who came into the Oval Office and was just mesmerized to see a president with the same color skin that he had. But he asked President Obama, is your hair the same as mine? And President Obama said, well, why don't you check it out? And so he bent down so the little boy could touch his hair. And President Obama said, well, what do you think? And the little boy said, yeah, your hair's pretty much the same as mine. Just like that 5-year-old boy who could perhaps see himself as president one day, we want everyone from all ethnic groups to feel like they have a place in God's ongoing story. Amen.
We're so glad that you listened to the message today. If you're looking for an open and affirming, peace-loving, and justice-seeking congregation, consider visiting us for in-person worship on Sundays at 9:30 a.m. We'd love to meet you.